ourselves.
Jan says I should start the ship on time, so I'm going to start the ship on time. Welcome to this afternoon's. We have some interesting papers lined up, and I'll just go ahead and introduce our first speaker, who is Vincent Reynolds. Vincent has been a co-worker at Camphill, Glencraig in Ireland since 1983. He has served in many positions at Glencraig, including his current position as the volunteer coordinator. His talk today is entitled Creating an Inclusive Community, Nurturing Gratitude, Compassion, Responsibility, Peace, and Kindness. And just so you know, we're going to take questions at the end of the three papers. So Vincent, things over to you.
Okay, thank you, Debbie. Jenny, can you hear me online? Just make sure that they can hear.
Yes.
Good. So there's going to be some interactive aspect of this talk. So I'd ask the people who are here in the Audicon to maybe take a photo of the QR code on your phone, because I don't think it works with the laptops with the internet connection. And the people who are remotely in the Zoom rooms, if you could also maybe link into Mentimeter. We're not going to do it straight away, but there's going to be a few parts of the presentation where we'll get some feedback through that, yeah. But I'll just start because you will be able to log into Mentimeter later, yeah. You lost it? Sorry. Go back. Give you a few more. Down? Yeah. Yep. That's yep. Yep. As I move the slides, but you don't have to look at that, you can look here. All right, so we'll make a start then. You can link into it later. So this presentation then is about creating an inclusive community by nurturing gratitude, compassion, responsibility, peace, kindness. And it's about work I've been doing with volunteers who've been based at Glencraig for the last 2 years. So the Camphill community, Glencraig, it's in Northern Ireland. It's quite a large estate, 100 acres. And there's around 100 people living in the community. And then we've got over 250 people who are employed. So this is the big statement. So in the past, Glencraig was an intentional community. We're no longer. That doesn't work. Okay. Sorry. So it's no longer an intentional community. Like in the past few years, the main responsibility for the organization is now carried by a group of senior managers, but there is the possibility of some community initiatives still taking place, and the senior managers are very supportive of some of these initiatives. And one of them is about volunteering. So Glencraig has always had quite a lot of volunteers coming, international volunteers, At the moment, we have 26 international volunteers who come from many different countries between 6 to 12 months. And in March 2022, we just finished our first European Solidarity Corps project. And a lot of the sort of content from this presentation will come from feedback from the volunteers who participate in that project. So the outcomes that matter approach, this is an evaluation approach that we use with the volunteers who come to Glencraig. It was developed by this man, Leon Fulcher, and his colleague, Tom Garfat. And, you know, like it's a unique solution looking at consistent challenges and measuring outcomes. So it's looking at outcomes, but doing it in a very holistic approach. And one of the frameworks behind the outcomes that matter is the Circle of Courage, which is from the North American indigenous cultures. So with the Native Americans, you had the medicine wheel, and the 4 aspects were belonging, mastery, independence, and generosity. So with Native Americans, they didn't just sort of look at developing one skill, but you had to develop these 4 aspects together. And they've also incorporated the Maori ancestral home, the whole sort of concept behind that in the outcomes that matter approach. Yeah, so these 2 approaches then, you know, like the Circle of Courage and the Tawari Tapawa metaphor for the ancestral home, you know, they helped create a very holistic reporting approach. So within Glencraig then, like with the outcomes that matter, it was actually developed for young people in care, you know, like in foster care and residential care. And behind it, it was usually a carer doing the evaluation for one of the young people. But it's been adapted by Glencraig that the volunteers do it themselves. They look at the aspects then that are important for them as volunteers. And there's some things which are very important, like one is that it provides useful and important information to the project coordinator. I had to do a report for the European Solidarity Corps project, and it was sort of wonderful to have so much data from the volunteers that she could incorporate into the report, which showed their experience. And it's also very helpful to have a sort of dialogue with the volunteers because, you know, sometimes you can ask volunteers, how's it going? And they just say it's fine. But, you know, what happens is they would do one of these evaluations, and then after that, we'd have a conversation. So you get quite a broad perspective of the things that they're experiencing. But these 2 now are probably the most important aspects for the volunteers. You know, like it helps them to have a reflective journal for their time at Glencraig, where they can sort of, you know, reflect on what they've learned through their time there. And then we've also sort of used it to nurture these following virtues. Now, when we set up the outcomes that matter approach first, we weren't using these virtues. We were just using the Circle of Courage with belonging and mastery. But these virtues then were added during the time of the pandemic because, you know, like around March, April 2020, when the volunteering project started up, you know, like, you know, I sort of became very aware, and we, you know, like we had it sort of this morning, Cynthia mentioned about sort of gratitude, you know, and in the UK, there was a lot of talk, and, you know, also in other countries, gratitude for key workers, the health service, the health service for all the work that they were doing, but also, you know, like having compassion for other people, a certain responsibility we had to take. And I suppose also a very important one was peace and kindness, because, you know, like there was so much anxiety at that time and people were very agitated about a lot of things that were going on. So these virtues were incorporated into it. And it's sort of, it sort of really came about also because I was aware of what Rudolf Steiner said. Rudolf Steiner said the three most important virtues in education are gratitude, which the child should develop from birth to 7. And he mentioned love, which is, can be the same as compassion from 7 to 14. And then he mentioned about duty, responsibility. He didn't mention about peace and kindness, but, I think through nurturing the other three virtues, you help to nurture peace and kindness. So with the outcomes that matter, then there's 20 developmental outcomes which were developed by other people who had done research. People had done research and they came up with about 40 outcomes that were important for young people. And then Tom Garfat and Leon Fulcher, they sort of narrowed it down to 20, which they considered were very important for people in care. And there's 10 which are internal. So that would be sort of to do with the person, and 10 sort of external. But I'll explain a bit more about that in the later on. But then also you would highlight, what was the highlight of the last month for the volunteer, any critical incidents or stressful situations, the support the volunteers have received from others. And then there would also be an area to record how they have nurtured gratitude, compassion, responsibility, peace, and kindness. So with the first area, belonging, and also like yesterday, Sarah and this morning talked about the importance of belonging in community. So, with looking at belonging, then you have 5 outcomes, which are all external. So that's really the sort of experience the volunteers, how they're sort of supported by others, how people are communicating with them, the relationships that they develop, the support they've received from others, boundaries for daily living, which maybe for the volunteers wasn't as important as for people who are in care. But then with COVID, that one was quite an important one as well. So in this slide here, you've got the feedback from some of the volunteers who completed this evaluation in 2020-21. So that was the sort of feedback that they have given. I've just sort of taken samples. I'm not going to sort of read it out. You can have a look at it yourselves. And then here's the other 2 outcomes in relation to belonging. So here's the interactive bit now. So how can we nurture gratitude? So I'd like you all to think about that, to go to the Mentimeter website. It's difficult to read it up at the top there. If you haven't got it, it's www.menti.com. And then the code is 93356072. So if you just go in there and, just give a bit of feedback, how we can nurture gratitude.
What's the code again?
93356072. Yeah, so there's really nice things there. I'm not going to read them out. Like, you should be able to link into this later on after the presentation. I'm going to move on. If you still want, well, you mightn't be able to add to it once I do move on, but I'm going to move on to the next one. So with the mastery outcomes then, there is 3 internal outcomes and 2 external. So with the external, you know, the supportive environment around the volunteers, the support they would get from mentors, tutors, and then with the internal ones, so how actively engaged in their learning. And, you know, this is very important that, you know, people come to volunteer in Glencraig and other communities, and sometimes they're very busy just working, and it's good that they can reflect on what they've learned through their different activities, their motivation to achieve, making use of learning opportunities. And this is the feedback from some of the volunteers. Going to move on to the next ones. So another interactive exercise then. So how can we nurture compassion? I'm not sure about the one in the top right-hand corner. You know, and by doing, as I say, this outcomes that matter, it's sort of good in a way because, you know, you can get the volunteers to sort of think about these things. And, you know, like it's mentioned there about empathy, and, you know, sometimes people mention mindfulness as well as important with compassion. So with independence, then you've got 4 internal outcomes and 1 external, which is about the activity programs. Yeah, and like with personal power, it's about sort of the volunteer being able to sort of stand up for themselves and sort of, you know, express their own views and not being pushed around by other people. Yeah. So some of the feedback from the volunteers. And then some more feedback. Yeah, so we won't do an exercise about nurturing responsibility. But yes, you know, like also just maybe to highlight a bit as well that, you know, as I say, Glencraig's no longer an intentional community, but it's still possible to do activities like environmental projects, you know, like taking responsibility for the environment. There's a group of people who are doing a beach clean, which was just a few weeks ago. And then with generosity, mainly sort of internal outcomes, you know, like service to others, peaceful conflict resolution. This was an interesting one, you know, like, because as well as doing these outcomes, they give it a score. And that was the lowest score from the volunteers who completed the last project. And, you know, like, it was a lot to do with, you know, people just, I suppose, avoiding conflict or not really experiencing that there was any conflict with other people. And then some of the feedback here. Yeah, and then with sort of nurturing peace and kindness, we won't do that exercise. But this is a photo of the Advent Garden in Glencraig from last year, you know, which creates a very peaceful atmosphere. And I don't know if anybody was on the walk in Herta. There was this lovely garden which Eleanor had made, which is sort of very, you know, like, yes, similar to the Advent Garden. It's like an Advent Garden for the summer, what she's done, yeah. The Advent Garden is at the beginning of Advent. And it was very much sort of, you know, one of the original impulses for Camphill that, you know, like Dan mentions in his book about Camphill. We're not going to do this because we're sort of running short of time, but I was going to ask, you know, if you had any questions, but we can take up questions after Libby's presentation. And yeah, you know, we leave that bit as well. So I just want to show you something else. Outcomes that matter.
Is it a method that Camphill has created for volunteers?
As I said, it was created by Tom Garfat, but we've adapted it for Glencraig. Yeah? I just want to show you a few things here. So I've just sort of linked to the page, and here on the left-hand side, you know, you've got examples of volunteers who've done presentations.
Oh, they can't hear since you switched mics. I think you need to go back.
Is it working now? Can I take it off?
Can you all hear me? Okay, interesting.
Okay.
Should we just, oh, he's good.
All right, okay. So, you know, on the one on the left, then it's about the reporting of the outcomes that matter, and then the presentations are on the second column. There's some blank OTM evaluation sheets, and then there's the website for the OTM. And then this is a lecture by Rudolf Steiner about nurturing gratitude, compassion, and responsibility. And we're just going to finish off. So I just want to finish off by a little flash mob video, which are, sorry. I want to finish off with a flash mob video, which our volunteers put together in 2020 when they had to self-isolate for a few weeks because of COVID. Okay, so they were dancing music. I'm sure they can hear it online. Okay, so that's me then. Thank you.
Thank you, Vincent. Hang on 1 second. All right, our next speaker is Dan McKanan. Dan's a senior lecturer at Harvard Divinity School, where he's taught since 2008. He has authored 6 books, 3 of them on intentional community. And as I'm sure you know, Dan is co-chair of ICSA. And his paper today is Why a Non-Disabling Society Requires Multiple Models of Intentional Community.
Thank you so much, Deborah. And I'd like to start with a quick advertisement. If Vincent piqued your curiosity about the young people you just saw dancing, they were among 400 short-term coworkers at various Camphill communities who participated in a survey we did this spring. And if you come to the Communal Studies Association in-person meeting in Canterbury, New Hampshire in the fall, you can hear a little bit about that research, probably also at the Camphill Research Symposium, which will probably be hybrid. But if I'm wrong about that, Libby will correct me later. Today, however, I'd like to tell you about 2 models of a non-disabling society. One is embodied in the Camphill movement. The other has been championed by disability rights activists and disability studies scholars, especially since the period of deinstitutionalization in the 1970s. These models don't contradict, but they are distinct. I believe that a combination might provide a surer path to a non-disabling society than either model alone. I also believe that all intentional communities have a role to play in creating a non-disabling society, not only ones like Camphill that make disability inclusion central. By integrating the 2 models, I hope to provide a blueprint that will be useful to all sorts of intentional communities. To simplify things, I'll focus on 3 themes from each model of a non-disabled society. For Camphill, these are rejection of quantifiable measures of intelligence, separation of work from income, and the use of rhythm to balance the human spirit. For disability rights, the 3 are the principle of nothing about it without it, the use of creative technologies to ensure access, and the critique of institutions to separate people with disabilities from the larger society. I'll identify some ways that each is already practiced in intentional communities and some ways they can be practiced. First, I should clarify what I mean by a non-disabling society. The phrase is rooted in the social model of disability developed by Mike Oliver and other disability scholars in the 1980s. According to Oliver and his colleagues, people are not disabled because they're unable to do specific things. After all, everybody can do some things and not do others. Rather, people are marked as disabled when society stigmatizes them for the things they're unable to do, or when they're prevented from accessing important social goods like education, meaningful work, or freedom of motion. So people are disabled not by their physical limitations, but because they live in a disabling society. A non-disabling society is one in which all people, regardless of what they can or cannot do, participate fully in society and have access to its goods. Camphill's founders didn't use the phrase non-disabling society, but they had the idea in mind when they described Camphill as a seed of social renewal. The idea was it wasn't enough to create a better life for a few people living in a Camphill community. It was also necessary to be a, quote, candle on the hill, helping to transform a world that had fallen into dangerous times, both by the horrors of Nazism from which the Camphillers had escaped, and also by the exclusion of people with disabilities from the center of society. So, what did this mean concretely? One answer was the rejection of intelligence tests. Founder Karl Koenig went so far as to say that these were one of the three biggest errors of modern civilization because they led to so much specialization and segregation in schooling. In order to steer clear of that error, Camphill's founders created a single school in which to educate their own children and the intellectually disabled children they supported. This predated by decades today's practice of mainstreaming, and in some ways it was more radical because instead of helping disabled children accommodate themselves to mainstream schools, the Camphillers built a school for children with disabilities and asked so-called normal children to find their way within that schooling. More generally, all Camphill places assume that every individual has a unique mix of gifts and needs, and they work on a case-by-case basis to ensure that each person is asked to make a real contribution to the community, as well as to have their own particular needs met. Camphillers strive, not always successfully, to avoid thinking about the people they support in terms of their medical diagnoses, treating them instead as complex individuals with particular personalities and goals. They understand that overcoming the error of measurable intelligence has implications for so-called normal people, as well as those labeled disabled. Life at Camphill can teach people with supposedly normal intelligence to relate to others on the basis of common humanity rather than cleverness. When Koenig talked about this, he made it clear that the antidote lay not only at Camphill, but in other intentional communities, specifically mentioning Iona, Taina, and the Bruderhof. He also stressed that Camphill was not intended, quote, as an asylum, a retreat, or a stopgap for handicapped persons, but a vital experiment for future needs. At the time, his identification of intelligence tests as one of the worst expressions of modernity might have seemed overblown. But from my own perspective, it was far-seeing. Universities in the United States spend hundreds of thousands of dollars educating students with high test scores, but only a pittance for students with lower test scores attending so-called community colleges. Intentional communities, at their best, invest equally in the aspirations of all their members. Second theme in Camphill's vision of a non-disabling society is the idea that work should be separated from income. This is a cherished and central value that is also controversial because to varying degrees, Camphill places have abandoned income sharing as traditionally practiced. The idea that work should be separated from income has its roots in Rudolf Steiner's social theory, commonly called threefolding. According to Steiner, there are three spheres of human interaction, each with its own logic. The economic sphere is where people meet one another's needs in solidarity. In the spiritual sphere, people relate to non-physical realities in perfect freedom. And in the middle sphere of rights, people work with one another, guided by the ideal of equality. Steiner suggested that while the buying and selling of the fruits of human labor belong in the economic sphere, labor itself belongs in the rights sphere. To sell one's labor is to turn oneself into a commodity, and that is dehumanizing. It's not obvious how this subtle idea should be translated into practice. Camphillers lean heavily on an essay in which Steiner articulated what he called the fundamental social law. This law states that the well-being of any community will be enhanced the less the individual claims for themselves the proceeds of the work they've done, and the more their own requirements are satisfied out of the work of others. This idea would probably be embraced by any intentional community that shares wealth or income, but each would enact the law in its own particular way. It might come as a surprise, therefore, that the essay in which Steiner made this point was largely structured as a critique of the utopian socialist Robert Owen. Steiner appreciated Owen's cooperative ideals, but he disagreed with Owen's premise that we can change human nature by changing social structures. For this reason, he presented the fundamental social law as something that would only work if everybody was always choosing it freely. Still, the early Camphillers enacted it in a way that was a little bit more like Owen's way than Steiner's. All Camphillers worked without salaries, all were asked to report on their needs in terms of clothing and travel, and each community strove to meet those needs to the best of its ability. Because the system was practiced in every Camphill, many Camphillers became, quote, sleepy in their relationship to money and economics. As the communities became more prosperous, it was easy to just give everybody what they needed and not think about it. Things are very different today. Few Camphill places still practice strict income sharing. In some nations, the labor laws demand that everybody who works in Camphill gets a salary according to the particular work that they do. In others, social care authorities insist on conventional salaries to ensure that money is being spent for the designated purposes. Still, other Camphills have been able to preserve a modified form of income sharing for residential co-workers while paying conventional salaries to those who commute in and out of the community. Though these changes are a source of sadness to many Camphillers, they provide an opportunity for fresh thinking about how each person can still freely embrace the fundamental social law. That fresh thinking could be enriched by a dialogue with other intentional community movements, such as the kibbutzim, that have evolved in a similar way away from income sharing. These changes also provide opportunities to think about what the fundamental social law means for the person with a disability. Strangely, this question has not been front and center in Camphill conversations about income sharing. Even as compensation structures for coworkers change, Camphillers continue to take for granted that people with intellectual disabilities will not receive salaries for the work they perform on behalf of the community. Meanwhile, mainstream disability policy hasn't really come to terms with the fact that persons with profound intellectual impairments are often unable to perform work that is deemed worthy of a salary within a capitalist economy, even though they can do plenty of things that enrich the lives of the people with whom they share their lives. While people with physical impairments or minor learning impairments receive the support they need to enter the paid workforce, people for whom this is not possible are often treated as mere consumers. They have a right to choose their services from a menu of options, but not a responsibility to contribute to the common welfare. As a result, many people with intellectual disabilities receive subsidized housing, meals, and personal care from the government, but wind up spending much of their time watching television. Being denied the chance to contribute can be as disabling as being denied the social services you need to stay alive. By separating work from income, Camphill communities offer a more empowering alternative. Each person, regardless of ability, can be expected to find work that others will value, and they will likely feel more confident and happy when those others express appreciation for what they've done. A final non-disabling theme for Camphill is rhythm. For Camphillers, significant activities recur in daily, weekly, and annual cycles. Each day is divided into a morning and afternoon work shift. The midpoint of each work shift, there's a tea break. The main meal of the day is eaten between the work shifts, followed by an hour devoted to rest. The evening meal is a simple one of breads and spreads, except on Saturdays when a more elaborate supper prepares participants for the distinctive rituals of Sunday. At the beginning of each meal, Camphillers say a prayer or sing a song, then join hands and say blessings on the meal. They end meals similarly, signaling to everyone that it is time to begin their pre-assigned cleanup tasks. The cycles of the year are marked by a series of festivals. Some, such as Christmas and Easter, are familiar to non-Camphillers. Others, such as Michaelmas in the fall, reflect a specifically anthroposophical interpretation of Christianity. All are celebrated with both artistic and ecological activities. The Midsummer Festival of St. John's involves a large bonfire. A Michaelmas festival might involve the creation of an elaborate dragon made of paper lanterns. One might think the effect of all this rhythm would be a regimented lifestyle. But the intent, and I think the result, is really the opposite. Camphillers assume that some people have trouble achieving a rhythm of life while others are excessively rhythmical. They also assume that everyone in the modern world suffers from the loss of rhythm associated with traditional agrarian communities. By providing everyone with a stable shared rhythm, they reduce anxiety and enable all people to experience the freedom of enacting small variations on the usual rhythms. As this might suggest, the non-disabling benefits of life in Camphill accrue to all Camphillers, not only those who have previously experienced disablement in their lives. This is important because ultimately the only way to create a non-disabling society is to make non-disabling practices universal. This is more likely to happen if everyone sees how they can benefit. It might seem that intentional communities, to the extent that they are distinct from the rest of society, work against the universal embrace of non-disabling practices. But they can also serve as demonstration plots that will encourage wider adoption of non-disabling practices, just as eco-villages encourage the wider adoption of green building practices. I suspect that this function will be enhanced if more intentional communities that are not primarily focused on disability adopt some of the non-disabling practices found at Camphill. But what about the non-disabling practices promoted by the disability rights movement? How might these be embraced by Camphill and other intentional communities? One key ideal is nothing about us without us. All decisions impacting persons with disabilities should be made directly by those persons, not on their behalf by benevolent authorities or helpers. Some activists would say that Camphill does not fare well in this measure. Though some Camphill governing boards and leadership teams include people with disabilities, many do not. Most Camphills are incorporated as nonprofits, and as such may include a requirement that people who directly receive benefits will not participate in governance. This perpetuates the attitude that other people ought to make decisions on behalf of those with disabilities. Camphillers with disabilities can still participate in internal decision-making structures, but even at this level, few Camphills have a consistent practice of including people with disabilities in every committee that makes decisions on behalf of the whole community. Camphillers might counter that the disability rights movement does not itself fully embody the principle of nothing about us without us when it comes to people who are nonverbal or have profound intellectual impairments. Too often, people with physical disabilities speak on behalf of those with intellectual disabilities, or those with only minor learning impairments speak on behalf of those who literally cannot speak. By contrast, the Camphill practice of life sharing means that people without disabilities have abundant opportunities to observe the behaviors of their nonverbal housemates, and thus discern their preferences and take those into account in decision making. So there's more work to be done on both sides, and here's where other intentional communities can really help. Many are not incorporated as nonprofits, but in other structures that allow residents more democratic participation. Participatory democracy is the primary mission of some intentional communities. Many have experimented with practices of consensus or sociocracy that can include everyone in decision making without expecting that everyone participate in the same way. These democratic practices could be enhanced through a three-way dialogue among Camphillers, disability self-advocates, and people who are immersed in consensus or sociocracy. Another theme for disability rights activists is the use of assistive technologies to ensure full inclusion. All of us are familiar with the changes to the built environment that have been created in response to disability legislation. Ramps for wheelchairs, accessible bathroom stalls, special street crossing signals for people who do not see or hear. Camphill, like many other communal movements, has a rich architectural tradition, and you see it here in the Odanicon, or a related tradition anyway. Camphill architecture has been enhanced by the new accessibility technologies, yet it also reflects a somewhat different understanding of accessibility. Especially in the early years of the movement, it was common to build split-level structures that contained small flights of 4 or 5 steps. Camphillers assumed that some people with mobility impairments would actually benefit from repeatedly challenged to surmount small flights of stairs like that. Likewise, the Camphill School in North America was built on hilly terrain in part because the teachers hoped the students would help one another navigate the challenge of the hillside. In other words, while some accessible technologies are designed to minimize inconvenience and maximize independence, Camphill technologies at their best provide empowering challenges and opportunities for cooperation. Of course, it's not easy to get this balance exactly right. Challenges that are empowering for people with cerebral palsy may exclude people who have paralysis. Likewise, Camphill took too long to embrace assistive communication technologies for nonverbal persons because of an excessive faith in empowering challenges. Ultimately, all decisions about assistive technology must be subject to the principle of nothing about us without us. A final theme in disability rights activism has proven challenging for Camphill in ways that are conducive to the movement's growth. Activists reject institutions as inherently dehumanizing and disabling. It is disabling to live separate from the larger society because this makes it harder to choose one's own activities. It's disabling to be surrounded by people who are paid to care for you because the relationship between caregiver and care recipient is always hierarchical. And it is certainly disabling to live in a place chosen by your parents or social workers rather than with companions of your own choosing. Camphillers agree with this critique, but insist that intentional communities are not institutions. Rather than setting people apart, Camphills offer a reverse integration in which non-disabled people accommodate themselves to structures designed with disability in mind. Income sharing means no one is paid to care for someone else. Instead, all work freely on behalf of the common good. And most Camphills use extended admission processes and trial visits to maximize the chance that people with disabilities come to Camphill of their own free choice. Many disability self-advocates find these arguments unpersuasive, even to the point of arguing for policies that would prevent intentional communities from receiving disability funding. And it's easy to see why. Many Camphills are set at a great distance from their neighbors. The fact that someone is not paid a salary does not ensure that they don't think of themselves primarily as a caregiver. In any case, an increasing share of the care provided at Camphill is in fact compensated by salaries. Disability rights activists can reasonably make the same critique that Marxist socialists have long made about intentional communities. Even if these provide a good life for a small number of people, they can drain energies away from social transformation on a larger scale. That's why Camphill needs more dialogue with those segments of the intentional community movement, such as co-housing, that have reduced their boundaries with the larger society to a minimum. Perhaps Camphillers are right that cooperative communities are non-disabling in important ways that are otherwise unavailable today. And perhaps activists are correct that people with disabilities have a right to more access to the larger society and more relationships with non-disabled people that are not predicated on caregiving than is possible in a traditional Camphill village. If both of these things are true, then Camphillers should help people with disabilities to live in co-housing communities or land trusts or eco-villages if they choose. This might involve a partnership between a Camphill and another community, in which a few Camphill households relocate to the other community in order to give their members greater access and to model Camphill practices for their neighbors. It might take the form of the Hertha community, which, as we saw on our pre-conference tour, includes both caregiving and co-housing residences. Most likely, it will include some practices that I haven't imagined. So may the dialogue begin. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Would you guys like to take a stand up for just a second, a little stretch? Just because I know sitting is, you get kind of tired. That's good. Okay. All right. Okay, now I have the pleasure of introducing our final speaker, Elizabeth Sanders. Libby's a member of the Camphill movement in North America. She currently serves as the executive director for Camphill Academy and is a doctoral student in practical theology at the University of Aberdeen. Her paper today is Spiritual Formation in Inclusive Community, a Phenomenological Practical Theology of Camphill Communities in Process. Libby.
Thank you. Can y'all hear me? It's good? Yep, okay. So I want to start by sharing that last week, a lion of the Camphill movement, particularly here in North America, crossed the threshold. Helen Zipperlin joined Botten Village in its founding days, where she inhabited and inherited this idea from Carl Koenig that whatever we do in community, we do it together. So Helen's life is a real testament to the simple and mighty weight of that task. So I want to read a short story from Helen that was shared in her eulogy, because I think it encapsulates my project better in a few short sentences than I will in the next 20 minutes. So here we go. Helen loved watching the sunset. One evening, looking into the glasses and crystals on the windowsill, Helen said, "I can see the cross on those glasses, but light itself is not visible. When it meets the disciplined form, it reveals its glory in beautiful rainbows. When there is no form to reflect upon, light just goes through space and we cannot see its beauty and glory. Likewise," she continues, The light of God is pouring forth everywhere, always. It is made visible only when it meets a disciplined form. When there is no shape to reflect through, the light of God cannot show its beauty. Now, I want to become a disciplined form through which the light of God can show. So the focus of my study is the relationship between spiritual formation, Helen's disciplined forming, and inclusive communities as it exists within the Camphill movement in the United States today. So following Helen's lead, the question is, how do we as human beings in inclusive communities of difference and diversity, discipline our forms? And how do these disciplined forms shape our communities in turn? So first, a note on the concept of spiritual formation. So spiritual formation in an ecumenical sense is an umbrella term for what I like to think of as the methodology and methods of our spiritual life as human beings. So for example, in the Christian tradition, spiritual formation is typically described as a striving towards or a welcoming of being formed in Christ or growing into Christ likeness. So the methodology of Christian spiritual formation points to this relationship between human beings and God, that we are made in the image of God, and we can therefore grow into Christ likeness. While the discrete methods, known as the classical Christian spiritual disciplines, are the ways in which we do that. So that includes prayer, meditation, fasting, service, amongst others. The spiritual formation in anthroposophy, the spiritual philosophy founded by Rudolf Steiner that underlies the Camphill movement, is oriented towards an overarching methodology that human beings are works in progress, or as Steiner says in Philosophy of Freedom, ideals to be realized, what Goethe might call the phenomena manifesting in unique individual disciplined form. So this can be expanded much further in Rudolf Steiner's evolutionary cosmology, but for now, to stick with the horizon of Camphill, my working hypothesis is that spiritual formation within Camphill communities is community living itself, while the methods or spiritual disciplines of the anthroposophical tradition and others within Camphill communities take many diverse forms. I suggest that they are all means of supporting and expressing a fundamental movement between the transformation of the individual and the transformation of social forms, leading to healthy, inclusive communities. So I'm going to skip a description of my fieldwork for now because of time. And I want to start by outlining some of the fundamental social concepts within Steiner's work, and then try to bring this into dialogue with similar metaphors as they appear in practical theology. Then returning to Steiner to chart a continual process of transformation on hand of an essay that Dan mentioned earlier. So let me skip here past this. So starting with Steiner's fundamental social processes. So Steiner describes the fundamental social process as one of sleeping and waking. This is most clearly illustrated as a conversation between two people, myself and another. From the perspective of the self, we engage in two distinct gestures when we are in conversation. First, we experience social forces in which we listen to the other, subduing or quieting our own inner dialogue, perspective, and individuality so that we can, in Steiner's evocative phrasing, fall asleep into the other. So this social force is then complemented by the antisocial force in which our individuality emerges. We speak, we are listened to, and we awaken to the self. So like the Hegel referred to as this master-slave dialectic, this can be understood as something of a process of self-actualization, and yet very unlike Hegel, it is not a movement of dominance and submission, but rather of harmonization, where we are actively adjusting to and adjusted by the other. So for Steiner, the antisocial force is a relatively new phenomenon in the development of human consciousness. And while it can close us off from others in the world around us when it is allowed to dominate, it is a necessary and important step in the awakening of the I, or the birth of the true individuality. So in response to this risk, of the dominance of the antisocial force, Steiner offers a series of contemplative exercises, spiritual disciplines, to discipline this force and put it in the service of others. So shifting now from what we might call this cosmological context to a social context, these social and anti-social forces can be reframed using metaphors of giving and receiving. And this is really prevalent metaphor throughout disability theology, particularly practical theology that explores intellectual disability in human community. So in short, so the thesis goes, our culture privileges qualities of hyper-intellectualism or rationalism, strength, productivity, and individual autonomy. In short, the capacity to give by virtue of an abundance or overabundance. However, unlike sleeping and waking, this movement is not mutual or not mutually valued, but unilateral, and therefore receiving is devalued. By extension, then, people who are in a social position of receiving care and support, people with intellectual disabilities, co-occurring disabilities, health conditions who are otherwise marginalized, are devalued in society. So too is sustained caregiving. So while the potential to give on hand of this abundance is valued, acts of giving that transcend maybe the symbolic acts of charity that demonstrate just how much abundance we have are seen as perpetuating need. So this prejudice both reflects and reinforces, according to a number of practical theologians, a theology of might, a theology that has served the ends of colonialism, slavery, eugenics, and the entire hierarchy quite well. Theologians such as John Swinton, Hans Reinders, and Tom Reynolds in particular have argued that while disability or impairment is a real aspect of our human embodiment, we've made a fundamental mistake in privileging these other qualities in both our society and our theologies. It is rather our ability to form emotional relationships, our vulnerability, and indeed our reliance on others that reflects the divine in us. All human beings display these qualities and capacities, but for these theologians, it is oftentimes people with intellectual disabilities who manifest these qualities in profound ways. Therefore, in a reversal to the dominant, oppressive, exclusionary, and ableist cultural theological narrative, it is those people privileged in society, the so-called non-disabled, who are most in need to receive the gifts that people with intellectual disabilities in particular have to offer. This receptivity as a receiving or listening can be understood as a social force of falling asleep into the other. So while true dialogue is never a monologue, where there is inequity in society, those with greater privilege must listen all the more. While this is absolutely essential, I want to suggest that without a complement of active formation and often reformation of our individuality, this process will ever be incomplete. What I mean by that is that if through our own, as individuals, early formation in a dominant culture of hyper-intellectualism and individual autonomy is quite strong, especially if we are people who are privileged in society, we cannot take it for granted that we know how to receive gifts, how to listen consciously and with an openness, not only to growth, but more fundamentally, our own transformation. Indeed, we can't take it for granted that we can even recognize something that undermines the dominant narrative as a gift in the first place. So this leads back to some of Steiner's work. And one of the essays in a series known as Anthroposophy and the Social Question, which Dan actually mentioned earlier, where Steiner is reflecting on the work of Robert Owen and the communal experiment in New Lanark. So while Steiner describes Owen as this genius of social life, he has some critiques as well. So he notes that Owen has these two really powerful qualities: a, quote, circumstantial eye for institutions of social utility, and on the other side, a noble love of mankind. So we can see these as a something of a polarity, not that they're in opposition, but rather what their orientation is. So on the one side, we have this orientation towards social forms, structures, systems, and on the other, we have the human being, the embodied individual. So Steiner attributes the ultimate failure of New Lanark to Owen's privileging the former end of that polarity, as Dan mentioned, the idea that, quote, human misery is solely caused by the bad institutions under which men live, and that the goodness of human nature would manifest itself without more ado once these institutions were reformed. So Steiner proposes that Owen lacked a true understanding of the human being, and that from that, an understanding of how human beings must already be essentially predisposed by their own inner nature to reap the benefits of such just social structures. Of course, it's very important to recall that in an anthroposophical perspective, our inner natures are not fixed, predetermined entities. But anyways, so moving on. In order to be formed by social structures, by social forms, we are demanded to take up our own inner individual reformation. So paradoxically, to meet a receptive social gesture, we have to take up an active process. It is an anti-social gesture as inner work, be looking at ourselves in the mirror, so to speak, that Steiner insists cannot be overlooked. As one of my participants in my field work said, you don't magically leave all of your prejudices at the door when you join an intentional community. So as an analogy for those of us who have experienced, particularly in the United States, this wellspring of interest in anti-racist work in the wake of George Floyd's murder in 2020, we can see a similar process playing out, namely the question of what is it that white people in a white supremacist culture need to change in themselves in order to become allies and supporters who can truly say from the bones that Black lives matter. So after speaking on Owen and this polarity between the individual and the social, Steiner explores what it means to have a healthy community. And he follows this sort of backwards, starting with, as Dan mentioned, this notion of the fundamental social law. So he begins by describing this as a concrete practice of mutuality, giving, and receiving in community. The well-being of human communities, Steiner argues, will be the greater the more we as individuals offer the fruits of our labor to meet the needs of others. And the more we are willing to have our own needs met, not by our own labor, but by the labor of others. So this fundamental social law, as Steiner describes it, frames giving and receiving as a mode of interdependence. So for human beings to practice such deeds, Steiner suggests, nurturing social forms must exist. Steiner says this law only finds its living, fitting expression in actual reality when a community of human beings, here's the important part, succeeds in creating institutions of such a kind that no one can ever claim the results of his own labor for himself. So we need this sort of independence baked in to the structure of society, a structural interdependence, as it were. And yet we cannot bypass the individual and simply orient ourselves towards the development of just social forms. This, according to Steiner, is where Owen stopped short. Steiner suggests that in order to establish such forms at all, something must come first, namely that if any man works for another, quote, he must find in this other man the reason for his work. We must develop as individuals what Goethe would call new organs of perception, or as theologian Brian Brock would describe as moving towards a more personal interest in having our perception of others transformed. We need to be able to recognize the gifts that others offer. And so the polarity becomes a threefoldness: the establishment and constant refinement of just social forms, a personal, individual orientation towards development and transformation, and from these two, the embodied reality, living social processes of mutuality as giving and receiving. So I just want to acknowledge how the previous two presentations, this remarkable formation on the part of these volunteers in Glen Craig, and this, survey of social forms and practices, how much they need each other and demand each other to become truly enable inclusive communities. And thus, in conclusion, the daily practice of living in community, that mutual giving and receiving, is an outcome that is enabled through the mutual interplay of social forms and individual transformation. Spiritually or theologically is rooted in living community. In proper Goethean fashion, my last sentence, we don't need to look behind the phenomenon for the theory. The phenomenon is the theory. Community living is spiritual formation, and living community is spirit in formation. Thank you.
Thank you, Libby. I'd like to open it up now for questions. I think we'll start by taking a question in the room, and then we'll alternate with questions in the virtual world. So who would like to start?
This is really short and maybe a little bit technical question. I'm curious to know if any research has been done to overcome the problem of the shift in Camphill from income sharing to the unfortunate interactions with the welfare state through some of the experiments going on with universal basic income.
So there are certainly many Camphillers would be very enthusiastic about universal basic income. I know in the broader sort of anthroposophical conversations about the threefold social order, there have been proposals about universal basic income related to that. I think in terms of the first part of what you're saying, research about the shift, actually, a medical doctor who serves Campillers in a community that underwent that uh, shift in a very dramatic, abrupt manner has, kind of tried to systematically look at his own records for evidence of the health impacts of the shift. And there's a paper in my inbox that I haven't had a chance to read yet that he wrote on that. Yeah, so those would be, some dimensions. There's definitely a lot more that could be done. Libby, do you know of other things?
I don't know of any particular research. I think, yeah, like you said, the research on maybe impacts, is developing, and those conversations are happening. I think one of the things that would stand in the way of that implementation is, what Dan mentioned, that because economically, oftentimes people with intellectual and developmental disabilities who require care, who have support needs, are reliant on that state. And so it's to step out of that system is to potentially actually exclude people who are otherwise marginalized, and would only allow in some cases for individuals who come from wealth to access and help sustain communities.
Except for the fact that it's advocated for by some kind of Friedmanite ultra-capitalist proponents, who, yeah.
Okay, do we have a question in Zoom?
Not yet.
Okay, question in the room. Yeah.
I'm Nils Johan from Copenhagen. Thank you very much for your contributions. I think it would be very useful for the intentional communities to find out how we can open up for dialogue. And looking at where we are moving today with our world society, it's very important. But what could be of interest could be meeting points. I mean, how can we find open spaces with with concepts where we could find it meaningful to open up for this dialogue in issues about environment, in issues about personal development, in critique of the world society today with all the concepts and standards and so on. But I'm a little in doubt how we could find such a platform for the further dialogue between these intentional communities. So that could be a question for you. Thank you.
No, I already have a microphone. It's true. Yes. So two things come to mind. Two sites of dialogue come to mind. The first is one that Vincent might want to say more about. The sister-daughter, I guess, community of Glen Craig, Camphill, Holywood, is a really interesting dialogue space. It's a cafe, and maybe one or two households right by the cafe in in the town that Glen Craig is on the outskirts of, that has become, you know, a meeting point between Camphillers and everything from local teenagers who hang out there and politicians who make campaign stops. So a very organic way to create these dialogues is for communities to have small businesses like that. And in Libby's neighborhood, Camphill Sultane has really invested in a huge way in the town of, now I'm confused, in the town of Kimberton or the town of Phoenixville, Libby?
Phoenixville.
Thank you. With multiple businesses there as sites of dialogue. The other thing I realized as you were asking this, that I had not updated my talk after the pre-conference tour. So I certainly knew about Hertha as an example of what I was talking about. But on the pre-conference tour, we saw another really exciting example. It was the third community we visited, the one with the really complicated Danish name that I can't remember. But if you look it up on the website, yeah, it was in any case, it was the community that had multiple neighborhoods, and every time more people wanted to join, they would ask them to organize their own mini community in relation to them. And one of these mini communities was a collection of supported living households receiving government benefits because members of those households were people with disabilities. And so, you know, there was a really practical way of putting the intentional community, the disability community, and the government authorities in dialogue through bringing to fruition this practice.
I also wonder with the dialogue if it's something the Intentional Communities Association could take up. I know, you know, like we're thinking about other virtual conferences, but, you know, sometimes it's sort of quite challenging for us. We come to a conference like this and there's so much content about, you know, sometimes very technical issues or research work, but, you know, having a mini conference on, say, you know, interaction with the local community, a very specific conference or a very specific workshop that maybe only lasts half a day, because I think, you know, the ICSA is a very good framework of linking in with intentional communities, because, you know, there's a lot of organizations like GEN and different organizations and FIC, which are very specific for that. But, you know, the ICSA is very broad, and that might be something to look at, and looking from the, you know, the members, what sort of topics we want to explore. Yeah.
Do we have a question on Zoom?
Not yet.
Okay. How about in the room? Betsy?
Thank you for what a rich variety. Disability theology or ability theology, that's new to me, but I'm grateful for what you shared. And values, and how do you turn values into actual, pass them on, grow them and pass them on in individuals. I can really rich and of deep interest to me. And I live a little more in the 2 feet that don't combine yet. But I've been, I don't know, had my butt kicked a few times by disability rights advocates in my Grey Panthers network, and learned so much about the history of that, that movement and those movements, and trying to understand when people I meet say the community is not involved the way it should be, the community is not organized, and they mean the community of disability rights activists and just people with disabilities that have shaped my little city of Berkeley. So my practical question is, are there
papers, are you going to just, or how would I get the papers if you're writing these up? That's number one. Off the website. I'm just new to how to get that. And also, I would love to think about how some of this could go into an actual dialogue with disability rights advocates in my area who, you know, I don't dare talk to them about intentional community because they're like, the government should be doing these things. And maybe there's some mutual dialogue they might be open to, or I could learn from. Let's put it that way. Thank you.
Dan, I don't know if you want to speak to the first question around some of this sharing, but on the second point, I think one of the really fascinating and important developments in the last 10 to 20 years has really been within the disability community, the emergence of maybe complementary to the disability rights community, which is, like you said, really oriented towards what is the sort of access that the government should be providing, or resources to enable access should the government be providing. It's very, regulatory, legislative, sort of in that sense. So the disability justice community has really emerged in a profound way to complement that work, in a recognition of, yes, it's good. We need to keep lobbying, but it's not going to happen fast enough. It hasn't happened fast enough yet. And we are taking up the work of creating the societies we need to create already, without without necessarily the regulatory or legislative support to do so. And so concepts like mutual aid and intentional community within the disability justice community have a very powerful and active force that is very different from how I think those concepts are worked with in, this intentional community sort of world. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for learning and collaboration there. How that looks, is maybe a step-by-step thing, but I think there is a lot of work being done there that would, complement the work of intentional community and similar movements.
In terms of access to some of the work that's been done, I'll name a few things. We, as an organization, we haven't been great about making the actual papers available, but there's one person had said maybe we should create a Dropbox where any presenter who wants to put their paper can put it and others can access it. That would be one choice. I'm certainly happy to send my text to anybody who writes me an email and asks for it. The last parts of my book, Camphill in the Future, come at some of these issues in a somewhat different way from what I did today. I think there's a bibliography right on the Camphill Research Network website. And Libby, you've done, I think, the most extensive analysis of Medicare policies about how funding for care in the community can be allocated within intentional communities. And what is the status of that, Libby? Is there a way that Betsy and others could get at it?
It's an interesting question. I think a lot of what I worked on is a bit outdated now by about 5 years. And so I wouldn't want to necessarily distribute 5-year-old papers because things have developed in pretty interesting ways. But there are resources. I need to think about it.
I will admit that I am shy about this because I'm coming out of the communal studies world, not out of the disability studies world, and I don't want to get ahead of myself in super public forums. I think, Libby, you are more connected, and then Odile Carroll, who also gave a paper at this conference, is now in a doctoral program specifically in disability studies, and is a really great resource for what's at the cutting edge of those conversations.
I lost my program, so I don't know if we're stopping at 5:30 or 6.
6.
It's 6, so we have time for more questions then. Okay. Something popped up on Zoom?
There isn't a question. I just keep asking people if there's a question.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Hello.
Appreciate it.
Oh,
I
there's one.
I have a
No,
question.
actually, one has a question.
Yeah.
Go for it.
So this is for Vincent for his presentation. Thank you everybody for the presentations. They're very interesting. I understand that this survey that you did around your community was during the pandemic, and we had something similar, but somehow your results seemed very, very beautiful. And then we had something with a bit more like gloomy answers. And then after the pandemic passed, we asked kind of, or we talked about those questions, and we came to the conclusion that the answers would have been less gloomy, less dark somehow, because we're really affected. And the questions were not exactly the same, because also I haven't seen properly your survey. But then I was wondering if the perception of those things that you asked during the pandemic have changed now that we're coming out of the other side of the tunnel.
Okay, so it wasn't a survey what I was doing, it was an evaluation. So each volunteer who comes to Glencraig does this evaluation, usually about 2 or 3 times. The idea in the beginning was they would do it every month, but that was too much for them. So they do it about 2 or 3 times. And, like we did it during the pandemic, and we got sort of very positive results. And, like the main thing was that volunteers were very happy to be in Glencraig during the pandemic because they realized they could just get on with their life. Of course, there were a lot of restrictions around, like interaction outside Glencraig, but they really appreciated being in Glencraig. And they were given the choice at the beginning of the pandemic in March 2020 if they wanted to go home. And I think out of about 15 volunteers, only one decided to go home. Towards the end of, like the first sort of restrictions, around June, July, tension sort of started to happen then, because Glencraig had to have a very controlled situation because we were looking after people with a learning disability. So things were maybe freeing up outside of the community and not freeing up quickly enough within the community. So there were some tensions there, but generally, the feedback was quite positive. Yeah. I don't know, does that answer your question, Juan?
Yes, absolutely. The answers in your exercise were very beautiful, very impressive.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was very interesting, also hard to follow. It was very complex. But so first a clarifying question to Libby. In the last sentence you said the Burkean notion, was it Burkean, like is in Edmund Burke, or did I get it wrong?
No, Goethe, as in Johann Wolfgang Goethe.
Okay.
In addition to being a poet, Goethe did a lot of scientific studies, and his methodology is very important to my study, but also sort of the development of anthroposophy historically.
Okay, so I will ask my question without leaving Edmund Burke aside.
Okay.
Because it seems, and again, maybe I got things wrong, but it seems like talking about I don't know which term to use, the non-people with disabilities, like the people who are considered
non-disabled.
Undisabled. Okay. That's a double negation. That's interesting. So the undisabled people, so talking about them right now, it seems like the bar that we set is very high. like in terms of like the process we need to go through in our perception of reality, our perception of ourselves, the way we behave, look at other people, the way we show our income. Like the bar is very high. And the question is, the reason I mentioned Burke, because Burke was a leading conservative thinker in the time of the French Revolution. So he said, never, nature said one thing and wisdom another. And what he meant basically, and what many of his followers meant, was that when you design a social structure, you need to take into account people as they are and not as they should be, which is another, both approaches are legitimate, but my question is, where are you on that spectrum between designing a community for people as they are? We have human nature, it's a given, and now we need to design around that the best system possible? Or are we going the other direction, like, no, we can design a system that won't change human nature, as you said, but can somehow elevate it or bring something else out of people? So where are you on that spectrum? Or you, Steiner, like the people you represent, researched? Is the question clear?
Sure. Yeah, no, definitely.
Okay.
So I think, I mean, if I had to choose one or the other, I would certainly say, we have no choice other than to design systems for where we are. But they have to be oriented towards maybe where we want to go. I think the way that I think about spiritual formation and how, community building is a part of that process. It is never ending, and it's cyclical. Those two processes of working on self and trying to refine community towards something that is more enabling those two are constantly reinforcing each other and developing. And I think, I would go back to what Dan mentioned in his description when he was talking about this, the fundamental social law, that, the health of a community is greater, the less, you take the fruits of your own labor and the more you rely on others, and vice versa. That is supposed to be a freely chosen aspect, a freely chosen activity. And that when we simply, say, oh, well, let's turn this into a policy that everybody's gonna follow, like Dan said, we can fall asleep to that. I think the way that Steiner actually introduces it in that essay is to say, yes, this is what you want, but to do that, you've got to take this step and this step and this step, and works pretty far backwards, all the way to the point of you need to start by fundamentally being interested in the person that you're sitting across from. So the bar is quite high, and I don't think that those ideal communities are out there, not yet, maybe not ever, but it is a process. Maybe that helps.
If I could just, add an emphasis to this, that among many other things, Goethe was one of the major pre-Darwinian evolutionary thinkers. So one of the people who was saying evolution is one of the baseline realities that we have to deal with, before Darwin connected this idea of natural selection to that. So that sort of Burkean ideal of taking people where they are, well, where they are is always in motion. And likewise with an intentional community, it's pointless to think about, where we might be in some imaginary future. But it's also pointless to think of where we are now as some static thing. The thing is to figure out, what is the dynamic process that this community is engaged in now, and how do we work creatively with that process? For example, if it's a process of greater individualization, well, you have to work with that. You can't pretend it's something different.
I mean, if I can just add one more thing, another emphasis onto there as an example of that. So back in the early days when Camphill had developed beyond being essentially a community of adults that housed a school for children with disabilities, evolved into a community of adults with and without disabilities living together, moving from what are known as the schools to the villages. there was a conference early on in that process. Oh, I want to say within the first 3 years or so of those first villages being established, but I might be wrong. And in that conference, people were getting together and sharing ideas, sharing experiences, and trying to improve this new experiment that they were on. And there's this amazing exchange that happens there in a question and answer session, where the people there, who are all non-disabled community members, start talking about how can we enable what they refer to as villagers, community members with intellectual disabilities. How can they take charge in running the village? So this question was out there from the very beginning. And like Dan mentioned, we still have a long way to go in that question of leadership, in formal ways especially. And so there's a constant evolution. So I would certainly not take the opinion of looking back to the glory days or the golden days, but rather a much more evolutionary look. And I think the critique of where we are now is the only way we'll ever develop beyond it.
If I could just, again, piggyback, at the beginning of your talk, Libby, you invoked the spirit of Helen Zipperlin. And the conference you just described is almost exactly the time and the place when Helen first encountered the Camphill movement. And what drew her in was precisely that she could see the way the adults with disabilities were coming to see themselves as the builders of a village. And that inspiration was something that she was always transforming through the subsequent, whatever it was, 60, 70 years of life in Camphill.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, everybody. I really enjoyed the presentations. And I'm thinking about this theme of transformative, of personal transformation, right? The individual level or the personal level that each of you touched on in some way. And thinking about Vincent's presentation where, you're describing some experiences in a structure that's provided for volunteers coming in for reflective journaling and service. But I'm wondering more broadly in these communities, what are there practices for inner transformation or personal transformation? I'm wondering maybe if rhythm is one of those, but if each of you could speak to specific examples of practices in these communities that are focused on supporting, encouraging that inner transformation, that personal transformation.
In the early days of Camphill, that was a very important aspect. And, when I came to Camphill, you were coming to support people with learning disabilities, but it was also very important, your own learning development and how you would develop as a person. And, I can't speak for other communities, but I can speak for Glencraig. And I sort of felt that over the last few years, there's been such a focus on the care that the residents require that very often this was sort of left behind, particularly with the volunteers. And that's why I looked at developing this outcomes that matter approach that sort of brought in these aspects of gratitude and compassion, which are very much about, self-development, the person reflecting on their life. And it's not just what they're doing within camp. It's not just what they do with supporting people with a learning disability, but a very important aspect was how the young people, the volunteers, got on with each other. So, I found it quite a positive thing within Glencraig, but, there was, before that, there was this sort of aspect that the volunteers were coming just to look after people with special needs. And there wasn't enough emphasis given on the personal development of the volunteers. Now, it varies from community to community. Yeah.
I want to let Libby go next.
Libby?
So, I mean, I think in terms of, I mean, Dan mentioned, in this rhythm, like you just pointed out, a lot of the practices of daily life and the way that those have been sort of culturally developed and practiced and turned inside out within Camphill communities. Those are, spiritual disciplines that take on the work of individual transformation. And so I want to sort of maybe set that aside. I can give one example out of my own work of where this can become actually super formalized and explicit. And that is in what traditionally in Camphill was known as the seminar. So the seminar was, originally essentially a study group that people participated in. And this was a training in anthroposophical curative education, social therapy, what's now known as inclusive social development. And within the US, in my role, I'm the director of Camphill Academy, which is essentially taking the seminar as it has existed and been practiced, where students in the seminar it's extremely diverse in terms of intellectual study, book study, movement, art, discussion, practica, etc. In the last 15 to 20 years, that's been formalized into an accredited, 5-year program. And so I think there are that attitude towards self-development, towards education, ongoing inner work is so baked into both anthroposophy and Camphill that I think there are a lot of examples we might gloss over quite quickly. I mean, I sometimes like to say that Camphill was a study group before it was a community, because the group of folks that were refugees from Nazi-occupied Austria started out as a study group. That's how they knew each other. And then this community and this community movement actually formed out of that. And so, I think maybe I'll leave it there and then pass it back to you, Dan.
Yeah, and I will name a practice on a specific practice within that structure of the seminar that Libby was just talking about, which is the practice of seminar participants doing a play together at the conclusion of their year. I think this has been pretty continuous throughout Camphill's history, and because my daughter Oriana spent the past year with the folks we see on the red couches there at Camphill Newton D as a short-term co-worker. She was just in the play, and so it would seem a little aside, right? What does doing a play together have to do with curative education? And as I heard her preparing for it, I was always imagining it as sort of a bonding exercise for the members of the seminar. But when I heard her tell about it after they had performed it, what became clear is that what they were really trying to do was to figure out how to do something that was deeply from themselves. So this is the back and forth that Libby was talking about. It was deeply from themselves that would also speak to every single member of their village. Now the village wants to say something too.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something. Sorry. That like apart from the multiple courses that are offered here in Camphill for personal growth, just the space of living here contributes a lot to that, because especially growing like yeah, personally, like with art, for example, because you're surrounded constantly by people that you can make a play together, you can play music together, you can read a book together, and that is an informal way of Camphill contributing to personal growth all the time.
I'd like to get.
Thank you, Juan. I think that's lovely and really speaks to, yeah, living in community as a spiritual practice. And I think, you know, knowing Marquis from L'Arche places such a large emphasis on this, that the I don't know, maybe I'll put words in your mouth here, but the spiritual practice of L'Arche is being with another person. And the, you know, that may be manifested in something like sitting at a table, drinking a cup of tea silently for half an hour. That is, particularly within L'Arche, taken up and recognized as a spiritual practice, as a spiritual discipline, and an important activity, even though it doesn't, it might not show up on a log of activities for the day if you're in some, you know, I don't know, a bureaucratic care setting or something. But it's really essential. And I think within Camphill, our ways of articulating those kinds of practices are quite different from L'Arche. We have sort of a different cultural style and aesthetic and way of talking. But there's a lot of familiarity there and a lot of resonance. We're cousins, I think you could say.
Marquis, did you want to respond to that?
Yes, and I'll share an image that that came to me as we as I was listening, and basically also based on the last interaction with the with all of us. Yes, and yes to what Elizabeth said. And I've been in the field of, I'll say, learning, self-development, organizational development for for the last 30 years. And I was really reflecting on from study group to community to a 5-year program. And to me, that says a lot about what has been happening in society in general. And I wrote it down. I said, oh my God, we've been actively participating in engineering, learning, and self-development, and how the engineers took basically over what used to be an art, what used to be sitting with someone with a cup of tea, and now it has to be translated into objectives and learning results. And so it's I don't have any I don't have any other insights than wow, that's a good one. Thank you. And I guess Lizzie, just to because I don't want to take too much time, because I was reflecting on the way that spiritual formation, the different types of ways to in terms of accompaniment, and so it was also a reflection in terms of the other comment from, do we take people from where they are, or do we bring them to where they want to be? And I was sort of, if we were to take people, generally speaking, from where they are, there would not be a lot of personal development or any type of formation. But once we engage with them, that's where we see the potential. And everyone comes to any type of situation with their own imagination anyway. So why not imagine what is possible? So that's exactly what was emerging throughout the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a question for you, and that's drawing the discussion back to the broader society a bit. And gerontologists have a concept called excess disability, and that's the idea that older people develop disability in excess of what you would expect given their physical condition because of the institutional environment and the caregivers doing everything for them. And so I was involved for years in a series of research projects in a nursing home where we tried to reduce excess disability by interventions to promote independence and autonomy of the residents. And we did things like teach the nursing assistants something called the system of least prompts, so that when they worked with the residents, they wouldn't immediately jump in and do things for them. They would, provide less intrusive interactions to try to get the residents to do more things themselves. And we did an intervention related to dressing, and we also did a family style meal study, because the meals were served on prepared plates where they were just brought in from the kitchen and plunked in front of people. And we created family style meals to try to increase the residents' involvement in actually choosing food and passing bowls and asking for food and things like that. And we got an amazing data of residents had reported higher quality of life, that they were more involved in their and less disability and things like that. And so we got publications, and we were all excited about what we did, and we thought things were wonderful. And then we went back and did follow-up data, and nothing that we created had continued. And it was because things like the nursing assistants didn't have time to use the system of least prompts, because they had such a heavy caseload that they had to rush through and do things for the residents. They didn't have time to let the residents do things themselves. And then with the meals, the health department said, well, you can't serve family style meals because the serving spoon touches the resident's plate and goes back into the serving bowl. And so you just feel like you can't make change within a system that's broken. And I was just wondering if you all had any guidance for how to move forward here.
This article that I mentioned that's in my inbox from the doctor watching a community, I think it's about exactly what you're talking about, and the way, basically the way when abstract ideals of disability rights and are refracted through a politics of austerity, which is what you're talking about in terms of the nurses not having time, the best ideals just turn into crap when it comes through austerity. That's all there is to it.
Okay.
Oh, let's see. Has her hand up.
Oh, was there someone here who hasn't? Okay, should I ask first if there's a question on Zoom?
There isn't at the moment.
Okay, so Betsy?
So I'm actually speaking from my own spiritual communities. And one is 12-step programs, and another is my Quaker, member of a Quaker meeting, a religious society friend. So my question is, are the community residents who are still being distinguished as disabled or not, what is their, are they invited to minister? Are they invited to participate in the values evaluation? Can they speak, and do they speak to the, inner light in each of us? I believe there's a capacity there. I assume that it's a different part of the brain. So I just wonder if you could speak to that, the moral growth, and also contributions as insights that they have as to connection and growth of spirit. Thanks.
So in one of the slides there was a picture of beach cleaning at Glencraig, and that was a sort of an event organized by the volunteers, but quite a few of the residents spoke about that, and very sort of moving presentations and their sort of perspective on issues like plastic and things like that. Yeah. So, within community, you sort of encourage these gatherings where people can express, what they think about. It could be coming together, like for funerals or weddings, where people can speak. And, it's sometimes very moving what, somebody with special needs can come up with their sort of perspective on life. Yeah, something, you wouldn't sort of maybe think about yourself. Yeah. Yes, but like, yeah, there are the opportunities for moments like that. Yeah.
Mhm. Can I just offer a picture? I mean, I think, yes, unequivocally. I mean, I think you would be hard pressed to find a lot of people who would say otherwise, or who would not consider, yes, in their own communities, in their own relationships, who would not bring up specific people who are spiritual leaders and spiritual mentors as well. And I mean, to give one example of an image of this, of how it can manifest, because that's what's so exciting and what's so unique, because of the extreme diversity in ways of being in the world. The ways that comes out, that spirituality is expressed and shared, is diverse as well. So there's a common practice that I think, Dan, you mentioned within Camphill, known as the Bible evening. And traditionally in this sort of space, there's a meal that's shared that is sort of elevated from the daily meal, and either before or after this, there would be a Bible passage that's read that has accompanied everyone throughout the week, and that list of the Bible readings is shared internationally, so everybody is doing the same reading. So when I lived in upstate New York in a Camphill community there, a woman I lived with, when the time came for the plates to be cleared away and the Bible to be read, some people would bring their own Bibles. Not everyone did. Not everyone identifies in that way, or practices in that way. But she was someone who brought her own Bible, but her own Bible was not like one you would buy in the store. It was essentially a scrapbook that she had made, of images, whether they were photographs or drawings, or cuttings from other publications that spoke to the spiritual message that we were reading in that text. And it wasn't just a collection. We were working with something particular, and she looked through that text, her text that she had created, to find the specific image to share, that resonated with the conversation we were having. So yes, absolutely. The ways that appears, the sort of spiritual disciplines, as you might put it in that classical language. Prayer does not look the same for everyone. Study does not look the same for everyone. And the more variety, the more like biodiversity we have in how those practices can unfold, the much richer I think the spiritual ecology of our communities can be. So she's certainly a spiritual mentor to me.
Well, we're at 6 o'clock, so is it okay to, so thank you so much to our speakers. This was a wonderful session.
Yeah.
Very grateful.
Yeah, thank you all.
Great to be with you, everybody.
Yeah, good to see y'all. Thank you, Vincent and Dan.
Thank you.
Vincent, I would like to follow up with you about your work. So we'll be in touch.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.